Reveal preference method is also known as voting with your wallet. And the concept is very simple, right? Suppose there's a consumer product, let's say a can of soda, right? And when the prices change for the can of soda, right? If it goes up, then people decrease their consumption. When prices go down, people increase their consumption. And through that change and we observe that change, then we can create an estimate, right, about how much is that can of soda, or how valuable is that can of soda to consumers. Okay? And so we're going to take the same idea and we're going to try to use the change in prices or change in costs to estimate the value of natural resources. Now, there are three most common methods right here, and we'll go through them just briefly in this chapter. All right, the first one is travel cost model. Okay, so this is using statistical analysis to determine people's willingness to pay, which is value, to visit a natural resource. Okay, and the goal is to try to obtain a demand curve. All right. Now, we haven't talked about what a demand curve yet, that we will cover that in chapter 3, but don't worry too much about it. Okay. Let's look at an example. What is the value of a state park? Okay. In other words, how much benefit does a state park bring? Right? So this might be an important question to answer, right, if we want to decide whether or not to fund a state park. Okay. Now, like the example I give you with consumer products, right, is easy to estimate the value because price changes for consumer products. Therefore, we can observe how people's consumption behaviors change. However, the issue with state parks is, well, most state parks are free or there's a small flat fee. Okay? And it is incredibly difficult to change the fees for a state park, in order to see how much people value, right, and see how if they change their visitation, the number of visitation. So there's no market to observe these changes, right? And so we got to find a different way. So the travel cost model is we're gonna use the difference in travel costs as a proxy for prices. Right? So imagine this map, right? And so at the center A here, that's where the national park is, right? And so we will categorize consumers or travelers, right, based on the region. So A is you're living, right in the park, right? B, you're living around the park, and you can think E is like you're living in the urban city, so you're furthest away from the park. Right? Now, the assumption here is as we move away from the park, right, the cost of travel increases. Okay, that's a pretty safe and a weak assumption. Right? Now, what should be considered travel costs? Now, there's the obvious fuel, auto expense, or flights, right? But then there's also time off work, right? Lost wages, and also time on the road, right? So, for example, right, when I used to live in Davis, and it was very easy to do a day trip to ski in Davis, right? However, if you live in San Jose, right, or just San Jose, right, then going to ski, might have to be a 2 or 3 day thing, or do a weekend trip, right? So the cost, right, to skiing, is going to be much higher if you live further away. Okay, all right, and as a statistician, right, we can start to collect some data. So we can say, well, let's do an estimate on travel costs. If you live in A, then travel cost is basically 0. If you live in E, right, then your travel cost is 40. Okay, and the next set of data we'll get is on average people from A, how many times they visit per year, and people from E, how much time they visit per year. Okay. You might notice in some of the museums, particularly national museums, they will ask you, if you go to the museum, they'll ask for your zip code. Okay, and so this is one of the ways, right? They try to evaluate how much people value the museums, right? How far are you willing to travel to get to that museum? Okay? And so I made up these numbers to make it look very easy. So the idea here is, right, for every $10 increase in cost, then the average visit goes down by 1. Okay, and so that we can say that's the value, right? That gives us a value of the national park, or of the park that we question. Right? So instead of changing the price, right, because there is no price to state park, we can observe the change in cost, and we can observe the change in consumption here. Right? And so that will be our proxy for the willingness to pay for visits to the park. Right? And the end goal of all this is to get a demand curve. So the goal is to get this demand curve, and we'll talk more about what a demand curve is in chapter 3. But this gives you the value of the product, right? For the individuals. Okay. Now, so in practice, right, we want to have data this nice. In practice, right, we will need like some things like regression analysis in statistics, because the data you collect will probably be scattered further along, right? Just kind of going into a pattern like this. Okay. All right, but don't worry. Like in this class, like we're not going to do any regression analysis, but you just have to understand the motivation behind the travel cost model. Okay. Now, for a more robust model, right? Okay, we need to include other variable as well, because if you think about here, right, when we look at this, when we look at our model here, right, we're assuming that everybody's preference is the same, and the only variable that changes is the travel cost. Okay. Now, one issue with that is maybe, right, people who choose to live in A, they like the park better, right? They have different preferences. Therefore, they value these national parks different than the people who live in E. Like people who live in E, right? Maybe they only visit on average 4 times a year, not because it costs a lot, but because they don't like nature, right? Which is why they live in E. Okay, and so we have to try to take these things into account. Right? So for a more robust model, right, the more variables you can control for, right, you want to compare, right? So right? So let's say that what's an example here, right? Let's say you want to find a comparable family that lives in A and a comparable family that lives in E. So meaning that the two families, they have similar preference, they have similar family size and similar income, and the only difference between the two families is that one is further away and one is closer, right? And so that way we can determine the only reason why a family who lives further away, right, and they're not visiting as much is because of the travel costs. Okay, but obviously this is very difficult to find these families, right? So that's what this is why you need a good techniques in regression analysis for that. All right. So then there's other things. Right? Are all sites, are all parks the same? Right? Maybe it's the amenities, right? Or maybe there's a nice restaurant near that park, and that's why people want to go there. Okay. Or what about proxy? Right. What about proximity? Excuse me. Proximity to other national parks. Right. In the Bay Area, you have some choices into what parks you want to go to. Okay. All right. And so on. So these are all things that you would have to include in that model. Okay. The second review preference model is hedonic pricing. Okay. We'll simply use the difference in prices between comparable goods. Okay. So for example, this is typically done in housing applications. Right. So we will select 2 different samples of housing, right, where every factor is comparable except for the resource we're trying to investigate. Okay. So for example, you can pick 2 similar houses, right, both a 3-bedroom, right, 2,000 square feet, right, 2,000 square feet, but one is next to a golf course and one is not, right? And so now the one that next to the golf course, let's say that it is $100,000 more. Okay, now if everything else is the same, then we can argue that individual who buys that house, right, values the golf course at $100,000, right? They're willing to pay $100,000 more for that property. Right? Here's a really good video to explain or to illustrate hedonic pricing. But this is hedonic pricing technique is used mostly in housing and this school districts. Right? When people try to when people try to understand how much is school worth, how much are people willing to pay for school for their children, right? They often use this hedonic pricing model. Right? The defense expenditure approach, right, is how much you're willing to pay to avoid the pollution. Okay. All right. So some of the examples here is, so for example, if you observe a household spending $600 a month on air filters, right, or if you observe that a household purchases bottled water every day, so then you can argue that the value of clean air is at least $600. Right. This household is willing to pay $600 a month, right, to defend themselves from pollution, right, to obtain clean air. Okay, all right. So this is what we call the defense expenditure approach. Okay, how much are you willing to pay to avoid the pollution? Okay. Now this obviously have limitations, and so the other ones. But one of the limitations is this. Right? One, right? We only get a lower bound, right, of the valuation of the willingness to pay, right? Because we only observe the household spending $600 a month. Maybe they're willing to pay more, right? Maybe they value the clean air a lot more than that. So if we observe that they spend $600 a month, then the only thing we can conclude is that they value the clean air at least $600. Okay. Now the second problem is maybe they're not doing it, right, for the sole purpose of getting the clean air. Right, we can cause an overestimation. Right, maybe they just don't. Maybe it's for example, allergy. Right? Maybe they want to get rid of pollen. Okay, or maybe the individual is buying water because they like the way it tastes, not because they're worried about water contamination or the lack of clean water. Right, and so it could be difficult to conclude, right, the exact reason why people are or the behavior of the people and how they're consuming. All right, so these are just some of the limitation here. All right, okay. Let's see this. Is it possible to estimate non-use value with the reveal preference method? All right, non-use values. So remember, these are the non-use values here. Right? Okay, and the short answer is no. Right, because the reveal preference method is also known as voting with your wallet. Right? We're observing consumption decisions. These non-use values, right, there's no market for them, and it is really hard to observe. People don't consume or they don't make consumption decisions based on non-use values. So only use values are captured. Right? So, and actually, if you think back at so all four methods so far, right, none of them capture or is very good at capturing non-use values. Okay, so what do? I mean, these are how do we estimate these values? So we have one last method, the stated preference method. We simply just ask.